The rise of Islam in Armenia, history, influence, and cultural transformation. Let's start the topic. Imagine standing on the rugged mountains of ancient Armenia, where stone monasteries rise from misty valleys and ancient churches whisper stories of faith carved into rock. Now, picture a new sound echoing through these same valleys, the rhythmic call to prayer, a language unfamiliar yet captivating, carried by travelers, traders, and conquerors from the south. This moment marks the beginning of one of the most fascinating chapters in Armenian history, the rise of Islam in Armenia, a story of faith, power, adaptation, and cultural blending that would shape the very soul of the region for centuries. Armenia, often called the crossroads of civilizations, has always stood between empires: Persian, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, and Russian. Its position on the map made it both a prize and a bridge, a land where faiths met, clashed, and sometimes merged. Long before Islam arrived, Armenia had already adopted Christianity as a state religion in 301 CE, becoming the first nation to do so. This deep Christian identity would define the Armenian people, but it also meant that when Islam emerged in the 7th century, its arrival would bring not only political change but also a profound cultural and spiritual challenge. The story begins in the early 600s, when a new faith was spreading rapidly across the Arabian Peninsula. Within a few decades of the Prophet Muhammad's passing, Islamic armies under the Rashidun Caliphate began expanding northward. Their goal was not just conquest, but also the spread of Islam's message. When these armies reached the borders of Armenia, the region was not a unified kingdom but a mosaic of small principalities under the loose control of the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east. This division made Armenia both vulnerable and strategically important. In 640 CE, Arab forces launched their first significant incursions into Armenian lands. The initial contact was not a dramatic clash of civilizations but rather a pragmatic negotiation between Armenian princes and Muslim commanders. The Arabs, under leaders like Habib ibn Maslama, understood that Armenia's mountainous terrain and fierce warriors would make direct conquest costly. Instead, they offered peace in exchange for tribute. This system, known as dhimma, allowed local rulers to retain autonomy while recognizing the authority of the caliphate. In return, Armenians paid taxes but kept their faith and customs. This arrangement marked the start of an era of coexistence, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, that would last for centuries. The Arabs established administrative centers in key Armenian cities like Dvin, which became both a military garrison and a hub of Islamic governance. Van's transformation was symbolic. Once a Christian and Byzantine stronghold, it evolved into a multicultural city where Arabic, Armenian, Greek, and Persian languages mingled in the markets. Muslim merchants traded side by side with Christian artisans, and over time, small Muslim communities began to grow. Yet, coexistence was never simple. Armenia remained deeply attached to its Christian heritage. While some noble families cooperated with the Arabs to preserve local stability, others resisted. Rebellions erupted periodically, especially when new taxes or governors imposed stricter control. One of the most famous uprisings came in the 8th century, led by Armenian princes who sought support from Byzantium to break free from the caliphate's dominance. These conflicts reveal a recurring theme in Armenian history: a relentless desire for autonomy, balanced by the practical need to survive between great empires. As the early Islamic caliphates gave way to the Umayyad and then Abbasid dynasties, Armenia's role evolved. The Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, preferred to integrate rather than destroy. They recognized Armenia's value, fertile lands, trade routes, and skilled artisans, and allowed a certain degree of self-rule. This policy led to an era of relative peace and cultural exchange. Muslim administrators learned from Armenian governance systems, while Armenian scholars were exposed to Arabic literature, science, and philosophy. Some Armenians even served in the Abbasid bureaucracy or as translators, bridging linguistic and intellectual worlds. The influence of Islam began to seep into Armenian daily life, not necessarily through forced conversion, but through proximity and interaction. Arabic words entered the Armenian language, Islamic art and architecture subtly influenced local designs, and new ideas in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics reached Armenian scholars. In cities like Dvian and later Ani, you could hear the call to prayer alongside church bells, a soundscape unique to frontier societies where two civilizations overlapped. But political tides changed once again. By the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate's power weakened, and regional dynasties began asserting independence. In Armenia, this allowed the rise of the Bagratid Kingdom, a revival of native Armenian rule. However, Islam's influence did not vanish. Muslim emirs still controlled parts of the land, particularly in the south, and trade with Islamic regions continued to flourish. The Bagratid kings, pragmatic in diplomacy, maintained balanced relations with both Muslim and Christian neighbors. This period saw one of Armenia's most brilliant cultural renaissances: the construction of grand cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and flourishing scholarship, all while Islamic science and art subtly enriched Armenian intellectual life. The 11th century brought new waves of change. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, stormed into Armenia as part of their vast conquests across Asia Minor. Unlike earlier Arab rulers, the Seljuks were warriors with a nomadic heritage. Their arrival was far more disruptive. Cities were sacked, monasteries destroyed, and populations displaced. Yet, as the Seljuks settled, they too contributed to Armenia's evolving cultural landscape. They introduced Turkish language and customs, built mosques and caravanserais, and connected Armenia to the larger Islamic world stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Despite invasions and hardship, Islam in Armenia remained complex and localized. There were never mass conversions, nor was there total isolation. Instead, there was a continuous negotiation between faiths, a coexistence shaped by geography, necessity, and mutual influence. In border towns, Armenian craftsmen worked on Muslim architecture, while Muslim scholars studied Armenian texts. Over centuries, even as rulers changed, from Arab to Persian to Turkic dynasties, this interwoven heritage persisted. When the Mongols invaded in the 13th century, they brought yet another twist. Initially, the Mongols were tolerant of all religions, and their empire became a network where Islamic, Christian, and even Buddhist ideas traveled freely. Under Mongol rule, Armenia's Muslims and Christians lived under the same tax systems, and trade routes flourished once again. This brief period of relative stability allowed Islamic communities in Armenia to grow culturally, though never numerically dominant. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Armenia found itself caught between two powerful Islamic empires: the Sunni Ottoman Empire in the west and the Shia Safavid Empire in the east. This division created a new dynamic. Under Ottoman rule, Armenians were recognized as a millet, or protected religious community, allowed to maintain their faith, language, and schools in exchange for loyalty and taxes. In Safavid-controlled territories, Armenian merchants played key roles in trade, especially the famous Julva Armenians of Isfahan, who connected Persia to Europe through commerce. The Islamic influence during this era went beyond politics. It touched food, clothing, art, and architecture. Armenian cuisine absorbed flavors from Persian and Turkish traditions, spices, pilafs, kebabs, while Islamic geometric patterns began to appear alongside Christian iconography in some regional crafts. In urban centers, Armenian calligraphers and Muslim artists sometimes shared workshops, influencing each other's techniques. Even in faith, some mystic parallels emerged. Sufi poetry, with its longing for divine union, resonated with Armenian spiritual hymns that spoke of yearning for God. However, Islamic rule was not without hardship. Armenians often faced heavy taxation, occasional persecution, and limitations on building new churches. Yet, their resilience and adaptability allowed them to endure. Over time, Armenians learned how to live within Islamic empires while preserving their unique identity. This balance of resistance and accommodation became a hallmark of Armenian history. As centuries passed, the map of power shifted again. By the 19th century, Russian expansion into the Caucasus ended centuries of Islamic political dominance in eastern Armenia. Yet, the influence of Islam, linguistic, artistic, and cultural, had already been woven into the region's fabric. Muslim communities remained, particularly in western Armenia under Ottoman control, and their shared history with Armenians continued to shape the social landscape. Culturally, the long coexistence between Muslims and Armenians left deep imprints on both sides. Armenian literature from the medieval and early modern periods often portrayed Muslims not simply as invaders, but as neighbors and fellow travelers in a shared, though divided, world. Likewise, Persian and Turkish chronicles described Armenia as a land of beauty, craftsmanship, and piety. These cross-cultural perceptions reflected mutual respect born from centuries of living side by side. Even linguistically, the legacy endures. The Armenian language adopted numerous Arabic, Persian, and Turkish loanwords, especially in areas related to governance, trade, and daily life. Similarly, Islamic texts from the region sometimes incorporated Armenian place names and even Armenian words, showing the depth of local interaction. In architecture, you can still find traces of Islamic influence in the domes, arches, and stone carvings of certain Armenian towns, reminders of an age when mosques and churches shared the same skyline. The rise of Islam in Armenia was not a single event but a gradual transformation, political at first, then social and cultural. It was never a story of total conquest or conversion, but of coexistence and complexity. Armenia, as always, absorbed influences without losing itself. Its Christian faith remained the foundation of its identity, but the centuries under Islamic rule added new colors to its cultural tapestry. In the modern era, the echoes of this shared history still resonate. In today's Armenia and neighboring regions, old mosques, Arabic inscriptions, and Islamic-era ruins stand as silent witnesses to a past where the call to prayer once blended with the tolling of church bells. The legacy of that encounter, the rise of Islam and its long dialogue with Armenian civilization, reminds us that history is not just about winners and losers, but about exchange, endurance, and transformation. The true beauty of this story lies in its humanity. Across wars and dynasties, people continued to trade, learn, and create. Muslim scholars translated Armenian medical texts, Armenian artisans crafted jewelry for Islamic courts. Even when political borders divided them, cultural bridges endured. This is what makes the rise of Islam in Armenia so profound. It was not merely a change in rulers, but a meeting of worlds that reshaped art, architecture, language, and even thought. As we look back today, the story of Islam in Armenia teaches a timeless lesson. Civilizations do not grow in isolation. They thrive through connection, even in times of conflict. The mountains of Armenia have seen empires rise and fall, but the ideas, songs, and beliefs that passed through them continue to echo. A reminder that faith and culture are never static, but living forces that evolve when they meet. Answer: from the first Arab riders who entered Divi into the Ottoman merchants and Persian poets who followed centuries later, the rise of Islam in Armenia stands not just as a tale of conquest, but as a story of transformation, a testament to how two great civilizations, Christian and Muslim, met in the heart of the Caucasus and forever changed each other. Thanks for watching the video.